Thank you, Joe, Margaret, and County Mayor, Chief Executive, Oireachtas colleagues, Hildegard, and I'm sure there are a number of others there, and former colleagues, of course, and a lot of the distinguished guests here, commentators, media, politicians, national and local. Thank you for taking the time to be here yet again. This looks like it's going to be a really stimulating week in terms of discussions. It's not often you drive to Donegal on a day like today. When you leave beautiful Cork, that's always in the sunshine. It's unusual to find it even nicer here. But the last time I was here, actually, the sun was shining as well, and Joe was trying to persuade me to go for a swim in the morning. Before I was still doing it. I'd recommend it. It's about 2 degrees colder than in Cork, but it's still worth doing. It's a real privilege for me to be asked to do the 17th annual John Hume Lecture. John Hume is a hero of mine, and he is one of the people that I hope I'll get inspiration from as we work together with the parties in Northern Ireland to ensure that the turbulence that we'll be talking about this week in many parts of Europe and in many parts of the world is not extended to our own island in the context of what we can do to put devolved government back together and to ensure that people of Northern Ireland get a government of their own, which they expect and deserve. And we nearly managed to do that a few weeks ago. I'm convinced we will be able to do that in September, and I know that the leaders of all of the key political parties involved in those discussions want that to happen. And I can assure you that from an Irish government point of view, working with the British government, we will do everything we can to facilitate that and to make it happen in the context of all of the other challenges that we need to work together on, some of which we will discuss this evening. Just on the title, before talking about Brexit and some of the other broader challenges in the context of the future of the European Union, I think it's important to say that global turbulence isn't something new. I spent last week in the Middle East, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Ramallah. I've had the privilege of being in Gaza in the past also. And so, in many ways, it's hard to pick a decade at any point in the last 100 years where there hasn't been significant global turbulence. But the truth is that we have got somewhat used to, in the European Union, stability, the prosperity that comes on the back of peace and certainty and stability. And really, I think, in recent years, we have come to realise that we should never take that for granted in the context of this evolving and developing project that is now the European Union. And we, together with other countries, will face significant challenges that we will have to find ways of overcoming. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on. But if the European Union doesn't have big ideas and big ambition to drive it forward, the cohesion that glues countries together in joint, shared effort will then start to be undermined. And that is even more the case when you have 27 or 28 countries as opposed to a lot less than that in the past, when many of the big ideas progressed and were successful around monetary union, around enlargement, and of course the core issues around peace and stability, and big and small countries working together to solve problems when they decide to pool sovereignty in order to do that. And so we do face big and new challenges as a collective, and Ireland as an individual country, through our influence within the European Union and indeed other multinational organisations, to find solutions. I believe the Irish mindset is hugely important to that concept. There's a switch there. Apologies. No, try that. Can you hear me? Am I? So let me just and of course the politics of all of this, which is perhaps the biggest uncertainty of all in the context of where it's all going. So first of all... Are we okay? I think everyone can hear me. Can you? Okay. First of all, can I say that in Ireland, Brexit has been mainstreamed in our public discourse for some time. And if there's any silver lining to Brexit, it's that the level of political and public engagement with EU affairs has in some ways connected many Irish people who otherwise wouldn't be that connected to the European Union and its relevance and its importance through the Brexit debate. I have no doubt that this detailed debate and the very real implications of Brexit for Irish citizens will have a positive impact on the levels of support for ongoing membership of the European Union. Of course, the contention by a small number of commentators that Ireland's best interests might be served by following the UK out of the EU has also drawn some attention in recent weeks. And it's not a question of dismissing such ideas out of hand, but in my view, and I think the view shared by most people here, is that and by clear and objective analysis, I think emphatically that Ireland's best interests, both political and economic, are served by continuing membership of the EU, in fact, at the heart of the EU. It's clear that Irish people recognise and support this approach. Despite the challenges posed by Brexit, support for our membership of the EU has increased over the past year and remains the highest in Europe at 88%. There are signs throughout Europe that the fallout from the UK referendum has awakened a greater sense of value of the European Union right across its member states. Indeed, as the complexity, challenges and consequences of Brexit have become steadily clearer in the year following the referendum, it is noteworthy that at the same time support for EU membership has increased in every single member state. I wonder actually if that's the case in the UK as well. We can discuss that later perhaps. And even the election results in the Netherlands, but in particular in France, I think have witnessed a firm rejection of the populism and Eurosceptic politics that were undoubtedly gathering momentum up to a year ago. From a Brexit perspective, it is clear that the depth of public debate resulted in an early awareness here of the profound implications of Brexit for our union and of the unique and complex implications for our country. This debate is something I will continue to stimulate and facilitate as Minister. Engagement with stakeholders, including through the All-Ireland Civic Dialogue, will continue to form an important part of the Government's response to Brexit. A key pillar of the Government's approach has also been to share our perspective with our EU partners, with a view to ensuring that our unique priorities and concerns are heard and fully understood. During the course of well over 450 meetings at political and official level over the last 12 months since the referendum in the UK, the Government has repeatedly underlined the importance of protecting the gains of the peace process and avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. Because for many of our partners, particularly when it comes to the complexities of Northern Ireland, they had the impression that these issues were largely resolved. But in the context of Brexit, it has been important to explain once again the fragility of peace on this island and in particular the complex relationship between Ireland and Britain. We've been successful in securing critically important recognition at EU level for the special position of Ireland in the context of Brexit. Core document after core document, from the European Council guidelines to the negotiating directives to the European Parliament Brexit resolution, confirmed the unique nature of our concerns and understanding of partners, of the need for solutions and flexibility. In other words, our EU partners listened to us and showed their solidarity in recognising that Ireland's priorities are the EU's priorities. And you will have heard Michel Barnier say that over and over again, and I believe he really means it, having met him a number of times now. And these priorities are clear. They can be summed up, I suppose, in 4 key priorities: protecting the peace process, no hard border on the island of Ireland. I've often referred to it as the need to maintain an invisible border, and in this county you understand that better than most. The need to retain the common travel area and associated reciprocal rights, and work for the closest possible future trading relationship with the UK. And in the context of the island of Ireland, try to achieve as close as possible to the current status quo that we enjoy in terms of free movement and free trade as we currently have today. These priorities are now being reflected in practice in the negotiation process itself, which were formally launched on the 19th of June. Michel Barnier and David Davis repeatedly highlighted that Irish issues would be discussed alongside, but distinctly separate from, the other Article 50 issues. We're happy with this approach, which reflects the need for outcomes to be driven in the first instance by political rather than technical considerations. Our priority is now to progress the Ireland-specific priorities and to seek out, with our EU partners, the imaginative and flexible solutions required. As the negotiating guidelines state, these must, of course, respect the integrity of the EU legal order, as well as solve practical problems for us. We all know that achieving our objectives will not be easy, and compromises and imaginative solutions to these issues will be required. Of course, Ireland's unique issues are now being discussed within the context of the wider Article 50 process, as the second round of negotiations get underway tomorrow. And just so you understand how this works, the way in which the negotiations will work from now on is they'll work in 4-week segments. So what happens is there's engagement between the principals in the first week, and then the second and third week are technical weeks where senior civil servants try to work out potential solutions and compromises and flexibilities and so on. And then in the final week, the principals come back and they try to get something agreed. And then there's a break. And then there's another 4-week segment starts. And so we're just moving into the second 4-week segment of the process. I think it's important as well to remember that there are 2 sides to this negotiation. The UK will also need to come to the table with an open mind and a spirit of compromise. One could be forgiven for being somewhat pessimistic in light of recent news headlines and public rhetoric. We've been told to go whistle by Boris Johnson in response to the entirely reasonable demand that the UK settle its existing liabilities and commitments before withdrawing from the European Union. The UK's recent withdrawal from the London Fisheries Convention was announced with greater bombast than was necessary, clearly with an eye to a domestic audience and with little regard for impact to European partners. Indeed, I think we could do with less political commentary from all sides, aimed at shoring up domestic political support bases, and more informed commentary in search of realistic compromise, but also an honest level of expectation for the broader public. And this isn't a criticism that is solely directed at the UK, by the way. That applies to parties here too, and it applies to leaders of institutions in the European Union in terms of how they respond to new thinking and new statements. We have got to stop speaking to our own bases, and we have got to start reaching out and finding compromises and flexibilities and understanding in a way that doesn't breach core principles, but in a way that can allow this process to move on. I have to say that I am concerned, having been to the UK and having studied in the UK, and I think having a reasonable idea of the British mindset. Much of my family still live in the UK. It's a country that I love, not as much as my own, but it is a country that I regard Ireland to be a real friend to. And I think it's important that we are honest with our friends in this negotiation. I think the expectations that are being built, that somehow it is possible to leave the European Union, to leave the single market, to leave the customs union, to be free to negotiate free trade arrangements and free trade agreements with other countries in other parts of the world, while at the same time expecting to have barrier-free access into the single market in the European Union. And that all of that is possible through negotiation because of the power and the scale and the size and the influence of the United Kingdom. I think that is fantasy, quite frankly. And when you speak to foreign ministers and other politicians in other parts of Europe, the debate and the context around the debate is totally different in most European countries in the context of Brexit to what it is in the United Kingdom. And Ireland, I think, is probably the only country that can talk honestly to both sides about that. And so there needs to be a context in terms of what is reasonable and what is possible as part of the ongoing political Brexit debate within the United Kingdom and within Westminster, as well as, of course, a need to explore a generosity of approach in the context of the EU negotiating team as well. And while I hope that those discussions are going on in private, certainly the public commentary that we hear from many politicians wouldn't suggest that. But this is a negotiation, and it's to be expected that there will be a degree of posturing and tactical bluster. Looking beyond the headlines and the political point scoring, there is perhaps, I would contend, some cause for optimism. The UK has agreed to approach the withdrawal process in the manner foreseen by the European Union, a phased approach that requires sufficient progress to be made on key withdrawal issues before we can launch parallel discussions on future relationship. The UK has agreed with priority issues, with the priority issues identified by the EU, namely citizens' rights, the financial settlement issue and other issues which are largely technical, and of course a set of issues on Ireland and Northern Ireland, including avoiding a hard border. They're the three core issues to be negotiated first, and that's underway. I know the situation with the border is of great concern here in Donegal. And from the very first day I became Minister for Foreign Affairs, the issue of the border and Brexit has been a number one priority for me, and it will continue to be. I can promise you that. I think it's important that we recognise that there is a lot of negotiation yet to be done, and it's still premature to set out a detailed possible solution in relation to the Northern Ireland issues. But I'm very clear that actually this must not be attempted to be solved through technical solutions, through using technology to try and make a border bearable. That cannot be the approach that we have, through cameras, through pre-registration, to try and avoid queues on roads and physical checkpoints on borders. We have nearly 400 road crossings on a border that is 500 kilometres long. And we are not going back to stopping people to check what they're carrying in their cars or their trucks as they travel from one part of this island to another. And I have to say, from my discussions anyway, with all of the parties in Northern Ireland, they are all determined to achieve that outcome as well as we are. And indeed, the British government also wants to ensure that there is a seamless border on this island. Finding a technical solution to do that, first of all, I think needs a clear political commitment that it will be done before we look at the way in which we achieve it. And we have different views as to how that can be technically and politically achieved. The UK has now put forward a paper on citizens' rights, which will be discussed in detail with the EU task force this week in the negotiations. Yes, there are significant gaps between the EU and the UK position, but we have a basis for discussion. And I think that is important and should be welcomed. And can I say that the UK paper in the context of Irish citizens' rights in the UK are particularly strong in relation to the common travel area, and I think that should also be recognised. With regard to the financial settlement, the UK government last week recalled that it will work with the EU to determine a fair settlement of the EU's rights and obligations as a departing member state in accordance with the law, and in the spirit of continuing partnership. Clearly not a resolution to the issue, but it's a far more optimistic outlook than the go whistle comments. The UK has also published a number of additional position papers responding to technical issues raised by the EU, which will also be presented during this coming week's round of negotiations. So overall, a more pragmatic and constructive start to the process than many people's commentary might suggest. It's critical that this positive momentum is maintained so that progress is made as quickly as possible on the many complex issues facing the negotiators. By continuing this constructive approach, I do believe that a successful outcome is possible, but it's a long way away. In particular, we must progress on the priority issues of citizens' rights, and as I said, the UK financial liability issues, and of course, our own issues here on the island of Ireland. The sooner progress can be made on these issues, the sooner discussions can begin on future relationships, including regarding trade and customs arrangements, as well as transitional arrangements for that to take place. The coming rounds of negotiations in advance of the European Council in October, including during the coming week, will be crucial in advance of the decision to be made by the heads of state of governments on whether sufficient progress has been made, including on the Irish-specific issues, and on whether the conditions exist to move to Phase 2, which is opening parallel discussions on future trade relationships. Issues vital to Ireland will be addressed, of course, in that Phase 2 of the withdrawal process, including in relation to the significant challenges that face individual sectors, such as transport, aviation, energy, agriculture, agri-food, and the environment. These issues are known to the Government, and we'll continue to elaborate our understanding and response through the ongoing conversations we're having with industry and broader society, through the engagement with our fellow EU partners, and through our own internal government analysis and coordination that involves all departments and so many of our agencies. The Government's position has been clear and consistent. We want to see the closest possible future relationship between the EU and the UK, including on trade. This objective is shared by both the EU and the UK. Finding a way forward is the challenge. However, it may take some time to conclude such an arrangement, and it clearly will. And it's for this reason that Ireland supports the need for an effective transitional arrangement that bridges the gap between a withdrawal agreement and a future relationship agreement. One of the EU's core objectives in these negotiations is to prevent legal vacuums on the day the UK leaves the EU, and to address as far as possible uncertainties for our citizens and for our businesses. Transitional arrangements will be vital to achieve this, especially for sectors, some that I've already mentioned, like aviation, financial services, health, energy, and in particular agriculture. I therefore welcome the Oireachtas Select Committee's findings and the conclusions in this respect. While the Government will work hard with EU partners to achieve a close partnership with the UK, supported by robust transitional arrangements, we also need to be clear that Brexit, however unwanted, will have consequences. And I think it's important that we don't dress that up in a way that makes people think that this will all be okay on the night, because it may not be, and we need to be preparing for that. Therefore, Member States and businesses must be prepared, and the Irish Government has been prepared for some time. We've already taken important steps to prepare our economy, including in Budget 2017, the Action Plan for Jobs in 2017, and our new trade and investment strategy. Brexit will be a critical factor in our long-term economic strategy. A new 10-year capital plan is in preparation, and we are revising our Enterprise 2025 policy. And we are in active discussion with the European Investment Bank for a potential increase in investment in this country, particularly in infrastructure. We're also exploring existing EU measures that could potentially assist Ireland in mitigating the effects of Brexit on Irish businesses and economic sectors, while also making a strong case to the EU that Ireland may require further support that responds to the fact that the UK's withdrawal represents a uniquely significant disturbance for the Irish economy that is not comparable in any other EU state. The Government is preparing a further paper on the economic implications of Brexit, building on the recent Government strategy document released on the 2nd of May. And the proposals of the report will be a very useful contribution, I think. While preparing at Government level to Brexit-proof our economy, it's extremely important businesses, and in particular SMEs who trade with the UK, must prepare too. And in that light, it is concerning that in the recent Intertrade Ireland survey, 95% of businesses surveyed had no plan for Brexit at all. The Government is seeking to support those businesses, and we want to reach out to them. The Government's enterprise agencies continue to work with companies, helping them to deal with Brexit, making them more competitive, diversifying markets with them, upskilling their teams. The Government has put in place a trade and investment strategy, Ireland Connected, trading and investing in a dynamic world, while Enterprise Ireland and Board Bia have also been strengthened so that they're better placed to assist food producers and exporters facing new challenges because of Brexit. I'd encourage companies to avail of the free Brexit services available from Board Bia, from Enterprise Ireland and from local enterprise offices, and to start preparing for Brexit. Finally, just on a political level, on the Brexit side, can I just comment on the new changed arithmetic in Westminster following the recent general election in the UK? First of all, I think it's also an opportunity after an election, as it always is, to have a new debate and potentially a new mindset towards the delivery of what was voted for in a referendum a year ago. And I know there is an ongoing debate, both across party and within parties within the UK, as to the approach of the United Kingdom in terms of how they're going to leave the European Union and the issues that are related to that, particularly from a trade perspective in terms of customs union and single market and so on. And clearly we have to be respectful in terms of our commentary as regards their debate in a British Parliament. But given the fact that there is such a direct implication for this country, I don't think we should be shy to ensure that our view is clearly understood, but in a way that is constructive, as opposed to the opposite. The second thing I'd like to say is that there is also a new context because of a confidence and supply agreement that has been put in place between the Conservative Party and the DUP, which is very much part of ensuring that the government has a majority in the context of putting the legislation through relating to Brexit. Many people see that as a negative. I don't. I think that if you look at the commentary of all political parties in Northern Ireland, including the DUP, they have made it very clear that despite the fact that, of course, they want Northern Ireland to remain as part of the United Kingdom, because they're a unionist party, they want to ensure that normality in the island of Ireland in the context of free movement and free trade, north and south, issues relating to the border, that can be protected in the context of Brexit. And so while they have given a commitment to vote in favour of Brexit legislation in the House of Commons, of course there will be significant political pressure on them to ensure that they are voting for legislation that actually makes sense for Northern Ireland and makes sense for the island of Ireland in that context. And so there will be a political onus on them to negotiate that with the British government to ensure that the legislation that they have committed to support is legislation that they can stand over when they come home to Belfast. And from that perspective, I think it is, and it should be seen as a political positive in the context of Island of Ireland and in particular Northern Ireland and border issues when future legislation is being debated and voted on at Westminster. So all in all, we are going to face, for the next number of years, a Brexit debate which will dominate Irish politics across multiple sectors, from fishing to farming to trade to financial services to employment to politics. to Northern Ireland, to peace process issues, to the relationship between my government and devolved government in Northern Ireland and political parties. And it's a discussion that we all need to approach in a positive sense, leaving our party political views at the door, if possible, trying to get big things done for people living both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. Let me just say a few things about the future of Europe before taking some questions, Joe, if I can. And I have a long speech here on the future of Europe, but I'm just going to put it aside for a second because I'd just like to talk to you directly about it. One of the things that the referendum in the UK triggered last year was a much more direct discussion within the European Union as to what the future held. The European Commission has produced a white paper focusing on 5 key areas. They've put that white paper to every country, every member state, to try to trigger a debate and a discussion, not just about those 5 areas, but about the kind of European Union that member states want to create in the future. And this is where I come back to what I said at the start. If the European Union doesn't have big ideas that can interest and excite people, if we start focusing solely on institutional arrangements, or whether or not we have to have a treaty change in the future that may require referendums in Ireland, if we start talking about the technicalities of Europe, we will lose our people. And instead we have to be talking about the big challenges that collectively we need to solve together. Challenges that Ireland cannot solve on its own, that Britain can't solve on its own, that even a renewed French political system will not be able to solve on their own. And we need to bring that debate to the public in Ireland in a way that engages them. I've already had a number of meetings. But what always happens with these things is the people who come to these meetings are people who know about this anyway, and who by and large are committed to the European Union. And so we're talking to ourselves, and not actually talking the language of the streets, if you like, in terms of why European Union membership and why issues that we need to resolve together need to be addressed through new, ambitious thinking. And that is the contribution that I want to make in terms of an Irish mindset towards the future of the European Union. Together, how are we responding and advocating for the needed change in the context of a changing climate? Together, how are we impacting on the approach on the continent of Africa, for example, on issues like food security, water security, population control and management? Because all of those things are linked to migration. And so in recent years, while the European Union institutions have been under pressure, it has been because we have been reacting to how development and change outside of the European Union, or in some cases within it, in terms of financial collapse, we have been reacting and responding to crises, as opposed to trying to actually impact on them before they happen. And let me give you a good example of that. There are 1 million people tonight on the beaches of Tripoli waiting to be trafficked on punts that aren't fit to get 50 or 70 kilometres across the Mediterranean to try to get to Italy and to try to get to Europe. In that continent alone, there will be an extra 1 billion people in the next 25 years. Nearly an extra 1.5 billion people by 2050. And so today, there are 18 million refugees in West Africa. There are 7 million children on the move as we speak tonight, migrating between countries in Africa, some of them wanting to come to the European Union. And so if we think, as a European Union, that we are going to solve this by a military response, or by limiting visa applications to the European Union, or by trying to build walls or fences to keep people out, in the context of the technology and the information flow that is there today, we are sorely mistaken. And that is one example. The European Union needs to be far more proactive in the context of creating a partnership between the European Union and the African Union to actually try to solve problems together. For two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do, which is what has always driven the European Union. And secondly, if we don't do it, in my view, the migration flow from the continent of Africa to the continent of Europe will simply be uncontrollable in the future. In my view, if you look at the numbers, that's just a fact. And so how do we respond to that? I've had a number of meetings with other European ministers, and we had an interesting one 2 weeks ago around a dinner table, and we were talking about future budgets in the European Union from 2020 onwards. And the starting position was, we were talking about, well, what are we spending today? And how much less will we be able to spend because Britain will be gone? And so how do we divide that up between cohesion funds and the common agricultural policy and common fisheries policy and so on? And I said, look, hang on a second. In 2020, what are the big challenges facing the European Union? Should we not start with what do we need to do before we figure out how we're going to fund it? As opposed to the other way around. And so we need to have a discussion in Ireland in terms of what is the European Union project about in 2017? What will it be about in 2020? And how does Ireland impact on that in terms of our own interests and our broader concerns about global change? As I said earlier as well, I was in the Middle East, which was a fundamentally depressing enough week. Really, really good people working, and in some cases putting their own physical well-being at risk, trying to help people on both sides in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. But within the European Union at the moment, impossible to get a common approach towards that conflict. And I think we need to reflect on that. The European Union is a huge power base, politically and from a trade point of view, if not militarily. And it can dramatically change and pressurise parts of the world to do things that are in the broader interest, if it acts together. If it doesn't, or doesn't have the capacity to do that, which is the case in many big and difficult issues, well then we become weak. But the most important consequence of that is that we will have new waves of huge problems to solve which politically we may not be able to solve, because they will drive division and they will also drive politics to the hard left and hard right, as we started to see happen when there was a financial crisis in the European Union, which we have managed, I think, to address and arrest. Every country in the European Union grew last year from an economic perspective, in terms of economic growth. And while some are under much more pressure than others, I think that financial crisis is now, in many ways, being overshadowed by other crises. But when you look at how we've responded to migration, we are expecting a country like Italy to take hundreds of thousands of refugees, while other countries won't even take hundreds, never mind hundreds of thousands. And that lack of solidarity will be, in time, what drives countries apart rather than pulls them together. And will be what will drive the politics of nationalism as opposed to multinationalism. And that we have seen, unfortunately, in a number of countries, and the consequence of that. And perhaps the most powerful country in the world is the best example of that. From our perspective, from an Irish perspective, we are going to be part of the European Union. We want to be part of the heart of the European Union in terms of decision-making and ambition. We will probably be the only English-speaking country. Cork will be the second largest English-speaking city in the European Union. And you would be well advised to remember that. When you're taking your holidays and that kind of stuff. But on a serious note, if we focus in the European Union on process and institutional change, we will lose our citizens. And I'm someone who's been in the European Parliament, someone who's been in politics as a relatively young man for the last 20 years nearly. And if you're not speaking the language of what people are interested in, you lose them. And that is part of what happened in the UK, which is why they are now turning their backs on the European Union, unfortunately. But in Ireland, we have an opportunity in the next 12 months to talk about what we want to be part of as a union for the next 20 or 30 years. The last 60 years has been an extraordinary story of peace and stability and growth and rebuilding after 2 world wars. What's the next 60 years going to be about? Are we going to solve climate change? Is Europe going to be a global leader in that? Are we going to help Africa deal with a doubling of its population in 30 years? And the consequences in terms of food and water security and conflict and governance and so on? And if we don't, what are the consequences for us here? These are the questions that we need to be asking and finding answers to. And this is why being part of the European Union is so important and so exciting. Of course it's an opportunity for trade and business. But it can do other things that are much bigger. And if we don't find answers to, will impact on the kind of life and kind of lifestyles that we expect. And that is why the Future of Europe debate is so important, and that is why I will be provocative over the next 12 months in terms of trying to get a response so that we submit a strong Irish input into the design of the future of the European Union, which I hope anyway, will excite many people in this room and will be the subject of future debates in MacGill. So finally, can I thank Joe and all of the team here for yet again being the premier summer school in Ireland and inviting so many people from all over the country and indeed people from abroad to want to be part of the debates this week. I'm sure it will be a fantastic success again, and thank you for all the work that you do, Joe.